So if you haven't finished your Amidah, please continue. I want to begin with two questions for you to consider. But before the two questions to consider, I also want to acknowledge once again the many of you who are here, plus the over 400 members of our community, far and close, who are with us online, who are equally important to us as our online community. It's been a blessing over these years of COVID that we've been able to communicate far and wide, both to all of you and to those who have joined us, even all the way from Israel, for example, Lihi, who's here with us, who is our Shinshinit, who continues to check into our services, and our friends in Uganda, who you will have an opportunity to meet, Samson, who is our rabbinic intern starting in January, and his cousin Bina, who is with us, and then all over the United States and all over the world. It's been a true blessing. So, I want to begin with two questions for you to consider. First, what was your understanding of Jewish community 3 years ago before the pandemic began? Take a moment and just think about that in your mind. And second, how has your understanding of Jewish community shifted since the pandemic? So the Torah describes the Jewish people as Ish Echad Belev Echad, one person with one heart, meaning that we don't just think about the other, but we feel for the other. We cannot view ourselves as separate entities, but must realize that each and every Jew is a vital part of the wholeness of the Jewish people. Now, while this sentiment was written thousands of years ago, it is echoed today in the words of Shmuel Rosner in his essay from Jewish People's Policy Institute on the impact of the coronavirus on the Jewish community. He writes, Judaism is a culture whose essence is collective. The religious precepts and laws were given to the children of Israel, and some of them can only be realized in a communal context. In the diaspora, where we Jews are a minority, the critical importance of Jewish life's communal character applies to the social and demographic spheres as well. Ish Echad Belev Echad, one person, one heart. The coronavirus, Rosner continues, has significantly compromised the ability to maintain a shared communal life. New habits have developed: mask wearing, working from home, social distancing, conducting one's everyday life with the nuclear family or alone, digital meetings, and more. Our own David Sweeson, the Jewish Journal, our Jewish temples in America are suddenly shaking, suddenly empty, and none of us can quite see where we will be wandering next. Now, we know it isn't just our synagogues. Can you fathom that the AJU will no longer exist as a center of Jewish life in LA? Built in 1977, it defined for so many of us Jewish LA, both with what happened within its walls and even just driving by on the 405 knowing it was there. And after 75 years, Los Angeles Hebrew High School is no longer operating. A source of great education and leadership for teens, so many of our teens here in Shomrei Torah Synagogue for 3/4 of a century. Synagogues across the nation have closed or merged, and we're not talking about just the small or medium-sized communities. Even the flagships, which we thought were invincible, have shrunk in significant percentages. While digitization was a godsend to us during COVID, it rendered unintended consequences, like replacing the needs to leave our homes for spiritual connection. And even now, even today, challenging the essence of what it means to be part of a community. And closest to home, our own synagogue has struggled to maintain its membership. We have seen shrinking numbers at our services, at our programs, in our schools. It has been difficult to gather in communal spaces and in each other's homes. It's scary. The dissonance is profound. The uncertainty of what our future here will look like, here at Shomrei, as well as what will be writ large for our diaspora community. To say that we can move forward the way we always have is to act like ostriches with our heads in the sand. But my purpose this morning is not to frighten. It isn't to make you turn and run away. It's the opposite. In fact, the good news, and there's always good news, is that you are here. The committed minority, the faithful ones who know and understand the value of synagogue life, who willingly, year after year, pay for membership, to belong, to participate, to enhance, and to grow what currently is, and to shape what can be. So instead of ruminating on the bad, even with the emotional unease that comes with change, how might we move forward in a way that can strengthen? How might we recognize that opportunities abound, and that just as the destruction of the Jewish temple 2,000 years ago created brand new ways of experiencing Jewish life, so too will our diaspora communities continue to not just survive, but actually thrive. Looking for metaphors to help focus on tomorrow and not on today, I was struck by this beautiful image as described by Robin Wall Kimmerer, an environmental biologist who also happens to be a Native American of the Potawatomi Nation. In her book, Braided Sweetgrass, she has a chapter entitled 3 Sisters. And she writes, 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, that they feed the people, feed the land, and feed our imaginations, telling us how we might live. Now, for all of you farmers out there, even you backyard green thumb gardeners, planting your summer crops, you may already know what I'm about to say. But for the rest of you, listen carefully to the wisdom of our Native American ancestors. For millennium, from Mexico to Montana, women mounded the earth and laid these 3 seeds all in the same square foot of soil. When those first colonists arrived onto these shores and saw these indigenous gardeners, they inferred that the savages did not know how to farm. To their minds, gardens meant straight rows of single species, not a 3-dimensional sprawl of abundance. So what's the advantage of these 3 seeds planted together? Well, it's quite simple. Corn. Corn seeds take on water quickly, fueling the growth of the corn embryo. Corn is the first to emerge from the ground, slender spikes of green leaves that will grow toward heaven. Corn provides a tall stalk for the beans who come out next to start their climb. The transpiration from the corn leaves provides mild cooling for these beans. And the beans, in turn, do 2 things. First, they have the amazing ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, helping to compensate for the large amount of nitrogen that corn needs. Second, they send roots deep down into the soil, creating a firm foundation for the corn and the squash to follow. Squash, meanwhile, is busy taking its time to arrive. But when it does, it will create broad leaves like umbrellas to provide a living mulch and suppress weeds, sheltering the soil to keep the hot summer sun from baking the earth dry. So at the height of summer, the lessons of reciprocity and interdependence are clearly written in the gardens of these 3 sisters. Their stems inscribe a blueprint for the world, a map of balance and harmony. In Camras' words, the organic symmetry of forms belongs together. The placement of every leaf, the harmony of shapes speaks their message. Respect one another. Support one another. Bring your gift to the world and receive the gifts of others, and there will be enough for all. Might this just be the answer to our post-COVID world and to our Jewish community? Respect one another. Support one another. Bring your gifts and receive others' gifts. So counter to the ways we often behave in today's world, in our institutions, in our government, even in our personal relationships. Reciprocity, interdependence, they're such simple constructs. Recognizing our complementary skills all blended together in a communal fashion to create harmony, balance, and most of all, abundance. Let me explain. What does it mean, first, to recognize others' gifts? Well, first it demands a certain amount of humility, of anava, of knowing what we don't know and what we do. What are we good at, and what ought we rely on others? Ask yourselves, what are the gifts that you personally bring to Shomrei Torah Synagogue? And what are the gifts that Shomrei brings to the larger Jewish community? I can still recall this is one of the more important lessons I gained from working many years ago with my mentor, Rabbi Zayman, Alav Shalom, a scholar and giant of his time. He nonetheless knew what he was good at and equally understood in what areas he fell short. So he smartly surrounded himself with colleagues and staff who excelled in all the areas that he was wanting. And it was this model that made his synagogue so successful. The interdependence of varying skill sets and gifts complementing each other, not competing and not operating separately, rather living interdependently and woven together. I hope I have been able to do the same here at Shomrei. I am daily grateful to my assistant Connie Tassa, whose organizational talent provides me the means by which I can better serve this community. Because if you know me, you know my ADD gets the better of me. Think of each of the clergy interns who brought their unique gifts and our cantors whose presence ensures that I will not have to sing for you. To recognize others' gifts also requires us to take the proper amount of space, not too much and not too little. Now, while I am no maven when it comes to classical music, I understand how important the role of conductor is. Is it not extraordinary that one single human being can bring together 100 disparate individuals, all I imagine with healthy egos, playing different musical instruments to achieve that sublime sound that we call music? But it can only work when each of those individual musicians creates space for the other, reining in their own talents to make room for others, and through that, achieve a symphony. If they didn't, imagine the cacophony and the chaos resulting in only noise and not beauty. So how? How do you make room for others, to learn from them and to grow with them? Can we make room for each person's gifts? Can we respect and honor differences and find ways to grow together in harmony and in balance? Parents, how do you make room for your children, despite your every inclination to want to inscribe in them how to be in this world? Spouses, partners, how do you make room for each other? I know it's starting to sound a little kumbaya, Rabbi, peace, love, harmony, oy vey. Well, not so fast. Don't be too quick to judge. Life doesn't always rest on equilibrium. While the music of an orchestra is beautiful, so too is the tension that is created by polarities. Sometimes interdependency actually works best when in opposition, when in tension. God created Adam and immediately said, Lo tov heyot Adam levado. It is not good for Adam to be alone. So I will create Chava, Eve, as his ezer kenegdo, his helpmate against him. Against him, not just for stability, but to create opposition, to challenge and contest and confront. So what happens when we eschew conflict entirely, choosing to surround ourselves not with an ezer kenegdo, but the opposite, with only those like-minded, like us, with only those who do not challenge or push us? What happens when we build walls against those who look different than us, vote differently than us, believe differently than us? When we choose to congregate or join or speak only with those who share our opinions and our ideas? Well, we know what happens. We have lived it for at least the last 6 years in this country, in our social media, and even, friends, in our synagogues. We have lost friends, relationships, family, and most of all, we've lost community. These are like the separate rows of corn and separate rows of beans and unconnected rows of squash. And we know the ending. Nothing will flourish. Our Jewish tradition succeeded precisely because of tension, because of interdependence on opposing views and ideas. The Talmud is filled with bar plugtas, individual rabbis who fought tooth and nail against each other to determine the truth, each seeing the world through very different lenses, yet all agreeing that the arguments were for the sake of heaven and were for the sake of strengthening and not weakening the Jewish community. So what has happened? What has happened to us? Where disagreements are not just disagreements, and debate is no longer for the sake of heaven and is now a path to permanent division and separation. Silos within our communities, unable to speak peacefully or to speak at all. These are like those separate rows, as I said, of corn and squash and beans, no longer interdependent, no longer growing from each other's riches, but instead they are independent, each standing alone. We don't have to imagine what happens when interdependence amongst human beings is no longer valued, instead replaced by this independence. When the ethos of an individualist approach is valued above everything else. It was Senator Henry Clay who in 1832 coined the term a self-made man, and in so doing helped spawn the disingenuous American myth that our individual successes and failures are based entirely upon our own merits. Nonsense. There is no such thing as a solely self-made human being. We, each of us, are made of thousands of others who have helped form us and continue to shape us, of generations before, of literally the DNA of hundreds of sources. And this is the highest achievement in our society, not a self-made person who stands alone. Far wiser than Clay was Mark Twain, who quipped, "A self-made man is like a self-laid egg. No one can make it on their own." This championing of independence, of self-sufficiency abounds in our culture, our values, and our country. So much so that we have forgotten how we need each other, rely on each other, and are part of a complex ecosystem of unique contributions, ideas, and then growth. Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Bazeh. Every Jew is responsible for every other Jew. We are all in this together. Interdependence. Unfortunately, COVID has made us forget that. It's driven us apart and bred a lonely culture, causing a rift in our ability to act interdependently, rendering us alone, disconnected, and lost. And our Jewish community is suffering, our country is suffering, humanity is suffering. Just look at the mental health crisis and the loneliness and distress that so many are experiencing. It was the great Jewish thinker David Hartman who once wrote that Pesach precedes Shavuot, because Pesach as a beginning story must happen before Sinai to become a possibility. The language of Sinai has to be heard by all the people, by a group of individuals who have become a collective. Solitary, lonely individuals with no sense of community cannot appropriate the spiritual life that emanates from Sinai. Judaism doesn't begin with a leap of faith. It demands a leap of identification with a people and a history. In belonging, in recognizing that the very way in which God designed the world, the way Judaism was constructed, our hour is more important than our I. And that our I must be transformed into a we through the historic destination of the Jewish people. If we cannot get beyond the self, we cannot hear the music of community. And so, in just another couple of weeks, we will be reading from the book of Ecclesiastes, reminding us that two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to the one who stands alone. Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. And even more, a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. Judaism, it so clearly offers an antidote to our divide, to the conflicts that rage, the independent thinking that continues to harm us, our country, and our synagogues. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. Corn, beans, and squash, 3 distinct species working together to feed and nourish this world. I know sometimes it may feel hopeless. Sometimes the separation and divide we experience, that we read about, that we encounter in our country and our institutions, feels like a permanent chasm, an unbridgeable gulf. And all that exists are those individual stalks of corn, trying to be the tallest and strongest amongst the bunch. The challenge then before us is clear. We cannot go at it alone. We cannot be that single stalk of corn. It isn't enough just to understand intuitively as we do with an orchestra. This notion of interdependence must have a claim on us. It must challenge us to behave differently, to be courageous, to be vulnerable, and to be humble. To recognize the gifts we bring to our relationships, our unique contributions, while paying close attention to those skills that we lack. So can we receive openly and give openly? Can we share openly in ways that strengthen, that feed and nourish us individually and institutionally? Can we make room for the other, not to cover or to overwhelm, but to allow an expansiveness and mutually beneficial opportunity for all? Imagine where coming together can be of great benefit, feeding our souls through our individual strengths to allow for a flourishing and spiritual uplift. not to be feeling alone. Imagine such a community here for us, for our children, and for many, many generations to follow, striving and thriving, flourishing in new and exciting ways. Imagine. I don't think we need to imagine, because I think the opportunity lies right here for each of us. Shana Tova U'Mituka.